this video, we're going to talk about some best practices with Spring Boot engineering, and specifically, we're going to talk about API docs as code. What we want to do is be following a spec-first development. That's where we generate our API specification first. You'll see a lot of examples where we can generate open API specifications from the Spring MVC controllers. There's a number of different tools that will do that for us, but these specifications often will lack richness. You'll have to clutter up your code with annotations, generate code. And then the other problem is your code is always going to dictate what your specification is. So it's very easy to inadvertently introduce breaking changes to your API. Very easy to do. So that's why I recommend going to specification first development. And that way you can enable parallel development. So if you have a front-end team that needs to code to your API specification, you can generate the API specification. The front-end team can work alongside you while you develop to that. And then both teams working in parallel meet at the end. As long as everybody's implemented what was defined in the Open API specification, your code will work. So it will speed up development, and it ultimately leads to better quality. And again, the inadvertent breaking changes, I've seen this happen multiple times. Very easy to do because your specification is always going to match the code, and you want your code to match the specification. So it's a different mindset. Then we want to treat our API documents as code. Follow the same best practices that we do for software with your API specifications. So like source code, you can break your Open API specification into manageable and reusable components through file references. If you have a modest application, I've seen specification grow to over 15,000 lines. That was maintained in a simple file or a single file that is just not maintainable. That's why you want to break into file references. Break things up into manageable and reusable components. This is going to improve the quality of your Open API specification because you're not repeating yourself. You'll have reusable components, and you'll have more maintainable components, much smaller files to be dealing with. Like source code, we want to develop the changes on a feature branch. We can use tools like Redocly CLI to verify the Open API schema is valid, and we can also run lint rules to verify the quality. There's a number of different rules that we can configure for that. And if you're in a GitHub environment, use GitHub Actions. So when we generate the pull request, we can go ahead and verify that we have a valid Open API schema, and it does follow our rules. So these are things that we can put into the continuous integration process. Now, we talked about Redoc earlier. Redoc is an open source. It's a React-based application that generates API documentation from Open API specifications. This is widely used. It's very popular. It's used out there quite a bit. You can see it in industry all over the place. It's becoming almost a standard for API documentation. A companion to that is the Redocly CLI, command line interface. This is a companion tool for helping manage it. It's got a number of features, but specifically it can take an existing Open API specification and break it into file reference components. It can take a specification that has been broken up and recompile it into a single file Open API specification. You can do this for releases and sharing it with different coding tools. We can also apply lint rules to verify the schema and different style rules. And while we're developing the Open API specification, we can run in a preview mode, see our documents live time, and make changes and adjustments to get the proper look and feel to our API documentation. Redocly does have an Open API extension for Visual Studio. It's very good. I've worked with a number of different extensions for Open API. This is the best one I've seen to date. Many of the different options will not support file references. So you get full support of Open API specification broken up into files. It works really well. You get autocomplete. You'll get syntax highlighting of any errors. Also, it has a documentation preview mode, so you can edit the schema real time and see the changes in the API documentation in a corresponding browser. It also will highlight lint errors from Redocly CLI, so this works quite nicely. Coming up in this video, we are going to take a look at the example of the API documentation. I'll show you how to use the Redocly OpenAPI Starter to create a starter repository in your GitHub account, and then we'll take a look at it in the Redocly Starter. The Redocly Starter is just the base OpenAPI specification. We'll take a look at that in Visual Studio and take a quick look at some of the features of Redocly CLI. Here on the screen is a Redocly API documentation generated from an OpenAPI schema. So this is for Jember AI. I am a co-founder at this company, so we're a very early stage startup, but this is the API documentation that we have right now. You can see it's fairly rich documentation. You can see the different operations. You can drill into it. It's got a nice user feel to it. You can see the rich documentation that we have in this. And what's nice about OpenAPI, different things like this here, you can generate Markdown in that, and we'll render out to HTML. So I got that bullet point list there using Markdown. So you can do some really nice things in your API documentation, do things like including links and stuff like that through Markdown. So you get really rich API documentation. And that's why Redocly has become very popular. This is effectively the default styling of Redocly. I haven't really done any changes to it other than adding the logo in the top left. So this is Redocly out of the box that you can utilize for your API documentation. And this is actually being hosted up on GitHub Pages. I hope to create a video in the future to show you exactly how to do that. But in this video, we're just going to take a look at getting the default Redocly starter going into your repository, download it, and take a look at it in the Visual Studio. This is the Redocly OpenAPI Starter. If you just Google Redocly and OpenAPI Starter, you'll find this page right away. What I'm going to do in this video is show you how to set that up. Say, use this template, create a new repository. You can see here it's going over this. Yeah, I'm going to call it Spring 6 REST API, and we'll make it a public repo so that we can take a look at this in the future. And I'm going to go ahead and say create that repository. This is going to take a few seconds to create. I'm going to go ahead and check this out to my local system and mount the directory using Visual Studio. So give me 1 second to do that. Okay, I've checked out that repository to my local system, and I've opened up that directory in Visual Studio. Now I'm going to be using Visual Studio here. I am using a plugin from Redocly. As far as working with OpenAPI specifications, the Redocly plugin is by far the best plugin I've found, so I highly recommend that. I normally use IntelliJ for just about everything. When I'm working with OpenAPI specifications, I will use Visual Studio because of the plugin that is supported for OpenAPI that's been developed by Redocly. Most of them do not follow file references. To set things up, the first thing that we want to do, you can see here, it says to run npm install. So I'm going to come up here, create a new terminal. And this is going to bring down the various dependencies that are used by Redocly to work with the OpenAPI specification. This created that node module, so that's where all the dependencies for Redocly are. So we'll be using some of the Redocly tools here, but what I primarily want to do is just do a quick overview of what's going on in here. We have the OpenAPI YAML file. This is just a baseline demonstration for the OpenAPI specification, shows a lot of the rich functionality. You can see it's got a variety of operations, tag groups, and whatnot. And I'm going to be updating this to the API that I want to develop. So I'm going to be deleting a lot of the stuff that's in this, but we'll go through and update that as needed. In this video, what I want to do is show you some of the nice tools that we get within this. So we can see here we have several commands that we can run. One is preview docs, one is to bundle, and another one is to do a lint. So let's run the test first. And what this is going to do, you can see at the bottom it's saying our API description is valid. And that means that we do have a valid API description on our system. And it's going through and it's going to test all these things. So this is a API description that has been split up into various components. This is a best practice when you're working with APIs or open API specifications. It's to split it down into manageable components. And what we can do is come back over here to our package.json file, and we can do this command, run preview docs. And this is a nice functionality with Redocly, is that we get this running. We can see that this is running on server 8080. So let me bring that up in a window. Toggle it over to my browser and went to port 8080 on my local host. And this is the actual API specification that's being generated. So we can see here, we get a very rich description of the API. We can get parameters. We can see the responses. You will see a lot of organizations using the Redocly API. This is very customizable. This is just out-of-the-box styling and formatting that you get with it, which most of the time it's going to be fine. Normally when I use it, I just add a logo. Might do some styling changes. I'm pretty happy with the way it is, so this works out pretty well for me. And you get a lot of rich information. So this is something that you can share with your API consumers so they know how to utilize your API. So I'm back in Visual Studio here, and you can see that this is still running, and you can also see that it's watching resources for changes. What this means is you can be editing your OpenAPI specification and have a browser in a separate display or just toggle over to it, and you can see your changes in real time. So that's a really nice feature when you're editing and updating it. So when you're all done making changes or viewing it, you just come down to this window, do a Control-C, and it go ahead and it shuts down, and I just close that window, and we're all done with that. If we don't want this all split up like that, what we can do is run this command, the bundle, and it's going to create a bundle.yaml file. That will be the consolidated OpenAPI specification all in one file, so it'll get rid of all the file references. That's usually good when you want to share it with different tools or some type of code tool that wants to bring in the entire OpenAPI specification. Might be like an OpenAPI code generator. That works well for that. So that's the primary features of the Redocly CLI. Now we did talk about the lint rules. If you come over here, notice that in the root of the project, we do have this file, the Redocly YAML file. This sets up different rules. It will go through and do a schema validation, making sure that your OpenAPI specification is a valid OpenAPI specification according to the schema. You can also set up rules and go to the Redocly documentation. You can see it at the top of the screen. There's a reference to a URL that's got the details on the configuration. So through the Redocly CLI, there's a number of different rules that we can apply. It's beyond what's in just the OpenAPI specification itself. These are style rules that you can apply to your OpenAPI specification and make sure that it adheres to your organization standards. Redocly does have a number of different rules available right outside of the box. They're good rules. I use them all the time. They actually do make your specifications of a higher quality. So not only do we have schema validation, but we have a variety of lint rules that we can apply to put additional restrictions on the quality of our OpenAPI specification.